Hello everybody, this is Sparklite. Sparklite is a top-down action-adventure in the vein of things like the classic 16-bit era Zeldas, and some other newer games that have also taken inspiration from those classic Zelda games for the most part. And in fact, the store page itself describes some of the biggest inspirations as things like A Link to the Past and Moonlighter. And in fact, those are the two games that actually came to mind for me when I was playing it myself. It's actually pretty reminiscent of games like that in terms of its exploration, its combat, the overall sort of theme of everything. It does feel very much like a sort of classic Zelda game meets one of the newer procedurally generated sort of action adventures like Moonlighter. You are in the world of Geodia, as it's called, and it is a sort of fractured planet due to some very unfortunate activities by a very evil man that you actually don't meet until near the end of the game, named the Baron, and his sort of mining expeditions. And most of the big bosses, or I should say really all of the big bosses of the game, are his lackeys, his sort of mining machines, and they are in each area. The game has 5 separate biomes that you will go through, each one having a boss that is appropriate for the biome. So like when you get to the Golden Woods, for instance, they are, of course, a very heavily forested, sort of constantly autumnal kind of biome. And the boss of that is this one in the background right here, which is basically a big lumberjack machine. So obviously it makes sense what each of the machines are actually there doing. It gives them a bit of theme and a bit of personality because the area that they're in is actually dependent on what they're supposed to be doing. And the whole idea is the Baron is exploiting this area for resources to the point of destruction, and you're here to stop him. You go through an area called the Refuge very early in the game, and that becomes sort of your hub. It's what you go back to every time you die, every time you beat a boss, and it's just sort of like your staging point for your actual missions down in the world itself. The Refuge is sort of a flying island, basically, that has just a couple of small buildings on it that you can upgrade, and the people that you will find down below and rescue and bring back with you. So it slowly sort of grows over the course of the game to become a larger selection of like ships and islands flying up in the sky above the planet, allowing you to upgrade yourself and have some safety in between missions. And I mentioned that the game is procedurally generated. However, it is, in my opinion, actually one that uses that whole procedural idea in a really good way. And somewhat ironically, it's because it actually has a lot of limitations as far as the procedural generation goes, so it can't just sort of do whatever it wants, and there is still a very specific sense of progression through the game. This is something that sometimes I find that procedurally generated games lack a little bit. They sort of lack that sense of you must go here first and then go here and just keep you going in, not necessarily a perfectly straight line, but some sort of like vaguely linear progression that makes you feel like you have an order to actually tackle the areas in. But in this case, there's actually a very good way to do that, because despite the fact that each biome is technically generated procedurally, they are put together from handmade sections, and each biome has a sort of gate that you need certain things to actually pass, which means you have to have beat the bosses of a certain previous biome in order to actually get the abilities or gadgets that you need to continue in the next one. So you do have an actual system of progression that tells you which places you can go to first and then where you can go to afterwards. And in that sense, it is very Zelda-esque, because of course you have sort of like mini dungeons of a couple of different varieties. I would say 3 different varieties. You have the actual boss dungeons that you will go to and actually beat a boss at the end that will give you some sort of large ability, generally speaking, for your drone, your little drone buddy that will help you get to new areas. You also have these little shrines that can unlock new gadgets for yourself. And you will have these little furnace sort of areas that are kind of like small multi-floor dungeons with enemies and puzzles to solve, and they will generally give you some sort of nice item at the end. A bit of an upgrade for yourself, generally. So in that sense, it is very like classic Zelda-esque, because you'll be going through these areas and getting new items that allow you to get to new areas, and that you'll, by the end of the game, be using all of in various combined, more complicated ways to actually navigate these zones. The gadgets are actually pretty interesting. So you're an inventor, basically. You actually invent gadgets for yourself, which means all of your gear is less ancient stuff that you find in dungeons and more stuff that you make yourself out of ideas that you get from ancient dungeons. So these shrines are the main way to get yourself new gadgets, and when you go to the shrine, it will have the gadget in it that you pick up, and the gadget is basically used as sort of like a tutorial. The whole shrine is basically a tutorial for whatever item you find in it, because it will sort of show you how to use it, and it will be a series of 3 or 4 rooms that involve like puzzles based on actually getting to know how to use it. And then once you get to the end, you'll actually put the gadget back on a pedestal in order to unlock the door to exit. And it will dissolve and turn into an idea, an epiphany as it's called, which is basically a crafting recipe, and it allows you to go back to the refuge and actually make it for yourself and keep it. This way you get the sort of Zelda-esque whole, like, you know, finding new items in dungeons and having the dungeon be a series of puzzles to help you understand how to use it through the rest of the world kind of idea, but also you get to sort of make it for yourself and use it in all sorts of different ways, because there will be just overworld uses for it, there will be uses in particular dungeons, there may be uses for them against the bosses and stuff like that. So you get the combination of like an old school feel of getting a new item and the newer school like crafting something that allows you to actually, you know, expand your procedurally generated zone and how much you can actually get in it, because of course you will come across lots of things that you can't reach at first, or things that you don't know how to interact with at first until you find one of these gadgets and make it, and suddenly new possibilities will open themselves up to you. I do like that. I like that each biome is very different. They have their own completely different sets of enemies, their own unique boss that's themed towards the biome, and like I said, their own sense of progression. That way, even though it is randomized every time, it does still feel like a coherent world with a cohesive, actually, line that you need to travel through in order to get to the end. Which might seem simple, but sometimes some games feel like they just kind of put in a procedurally generated world as a checkbox because they feel they need to. But with games like this, it's clear that they did it because they actually wanted to, and that there is an actual narrative reason for it, and there are gameplay mechanics tied to it that make it actually work with the game rather than just sort of be a part of the game because they feel like they had to. And I always appreciate that when they can, when developers can have mechanics like this and actually make them gel with the whole game to where they actually make sense. So you have a reason for the world being procedurally generated, and you still have a really nice sense of going to new areas and stuff like that in proper orders that you might not get from certain methods of procedurally generating a world. While you're down on the surface, you will gain the titular resource, Sparklite, which is a sort of like magical crystal thingy that is like an incredibly efficient fuel and has all sorts of other uses, but can also be burned to produce much more fuel than normal, but is actually very, it pollutes very heavily if you do this. There is very much a sort of environmental message throughout the game, which is pretty neat. And you will be gathering the Sparklite from everything from just killing enemies to digging it up out of the ground with your little drone buddy to finding it up in trees. It's just everywhere. And every time you die or beat a boss and end up back at the refuge, however you get there, you will keep however much Sparklite you gained in your run, and you can use it for different things. You can upgrade various structures, well, build and then upgrade various structures on the refuge, things like a gadget shop, or a widget shop, I should say. Widgets are basically like consumables. And having the widget shop available allows you to actually go down to the surface with a free widget already. Normally you don't start with one, you have to find them in chests and things once you're down there, so having that allows you to actually start with one, which is really useful. They involve things like heals, or like big cluster bombs, or big bursts of like 8-way shots and other stuff like that. They're pretty useful, and there are lots and lots of different kinds. And there's one incredibly useful one that is a sort of revive, an Ankh, a single-use revive, as long as you're holding it. Very useful. You can also go to the workshop that allows you to upgrade itself and get new places to craft things, as well as actually spend Sparklite to craft the gadgets that you have the epiphanies for from venturing down in those little mini dungeons on the surface to expand your capabilities. You can also collect these things called beats, which are like singing birds, and you get various rewards for getting different numbers of them. I haven't figured out what happens yet if you get them all, but I assume it's pretty neat. Also, they have an adorable little song that they sing as you collect them, which is pretty cute. You can even find this dude that catalogs the enemies that you face, and you can actually have him focus his research on one particular enemy, and that will up the damage that you deal to that enemy. So if you're having a hard time exploring through a certain biome, you can actually target effectively one of the problem enemies that you face down there and have a bit of an easier time defeating it, which is a really nice little mechanic. You can also do what you're seeing here in the background. Your wrench thingamajigger has this patch grid that starts off with just a kind of like a 3x3 9-spot grid, and it can be upgraded twice to get bigger and bigger. And you can find and obtain and buy these patches throughout the world and here in the refuge for Sparklite. And the patches are basically passive upgrades. You can put them on this grid and they will do various things for you. And once you upgrade the this room at least once, you can actually merge patches, which is, by the way, one upgrade that I recommend that you go for as soon as you possibly can, because that's incredibly useful. It allows you to actually merge patches together to, they start out as bronze versions of themselves, which are the sort of weakest version, and then you can turn them into silver and then eventually gold versions of themselves by merging them repeatedly, and that will strengthen them, make them provide a much stronger effect of whatever they do, while still taking up the same number of spaces on the grid, so you can be a lot more efficient. You know, you may have like 8 different bronze health patches lying around, which only give you 1/4 of a heart. So if you want a whole bunch of health, you would have to actually spend a lot of your grid on putting those hearts in there. But once you get the ability to merge these things, you could turn those into like a couple of gold hearts, and suddenly it only takes up a couple of spaces and you get a bunch of health from it. So it's very, very useful to be able to merge these as soon as possible. And there are lots of different patches, from your kind of obvious utility ones, like, you know, more health, to things like upping your damage, making your gadgets more powerful, giving you more energy, which is what you use to actually use those gadgets. You generate energy by smacking enemies, so it's useful to have a lot of it, because you may, you know, have some situations where you need to use one of them, like the bomb balloon to blow up a rock to reveal a secret or something like that, and you, if you don't have the energy, you'll have to go to a different screen to smack some enemies around real quick to get the energy. So having more energy is useful. And to the sort of navigational patches that act as aids on the map, so things that will expand the map of a specific biome as soon as you land. That way, however it has generated itself will be revealed to you immediately as soon as you're on the surface, so you'll be able to navigate it easier. To things that mark specific structures on the map for you so that you'll have an easier time finding them, like one that maps vaults immediately. Vaults are the little mini dungeons that give you new gadgets. Or some that have those furnace dungeons already marked, so as soon as you land you know where they are, and stuff like that. So there are tons of different patches, and this patch grid is a very important part of the game that allows you to, you know, it's basically your method of upgrading, because there isn't like a level system or anything like that. It's not really an RPG per se, again, kind of like Zelda, where, you know, it's not technically an RPG, even though it has some RPG-ish mechanics, but it has a very different way of upgrading yourself that involves finding and merging these patches to make yourself stronger. The combat is fairly simple for the most part. Again, I have comparisons to stuff like A Link to the Past and Moonlighter, where the combat is an important part of the game, but it is not like massively complicated. It's just, it's complex enough to work, and it does what it needs to do. You have a sort of series of wrench swings and a charged up hammer attack that you can do that can stun or knock down enemies and does a lot more damage, but slows you down while you're charging it, although there is a patch that allows you to move at almost normal speed when you're charging it, which is extremely useful. And you also have, of course, the gadgets that can help you out, things like a crossbow, a sort of like a lightning beam that you get later on, which is really cool, and that bomb balloon that I mentioned, although the bomb balloon is best used in very certain situations because it makes you stationary while you're guiding it around, so you don't want to use it in the middle of like hectic combat because you'll get hit, although it can be useful to deal like burst damage to bosses if you find a safe phase to use it in. And you also have, of course, those widgets that I mentioned, the various kinds of consumable items, and as you're probably seeing in the background here, the enemies are quite various. There are lots of them, and they have all sorts of different kinds of attacks, from projectiles that can seek you, explode, freeze you, or just kind of cover the screen, to melee enemies that simply run at you and try to hit you, to enemies like these, which have certain patterns on the ground that they will attack in, and you need to get out of the way. You do have a sort of rocket boot dash that you can use, although one thing I noticed, it does not give you immunity frames, so if you dash through an attack, you'll still get hit by it. You need to dash away from an attack in order to actually fully dodge it. That's something that takes a little bit of getting used to, because I'm used to a lot of 2D games having a dodge that gives you some sort of immunity for a very short time, but no, in this case you really do need to actually completely avoid an attack with the dash in order to not get hit by it. And the boss fights are really pretty solid. They're really interestingly designed, they look neat, and they get pretty tough later on. I would say that the bosses in general aren't that difficult, although the final boss is a different story, but they are fun to learn, and they have fun phases and a lot of attacks to learn and dodge and stuff like that, so it makes them engaging and interesting to fight. There are a couple of things that I would say are a little rough around the edges, but it's probably mostly just a either a suspension of disbelief or like a personal preference kind of thing. For one, I find it really weird that once you use a workbench, it's sort of used up. So whenever you want to invent a new item that you found, you have to build a new workbench. You have to upgrade the engineering workshop in order to actually be able to build anything, which is kind of weird. It's one of those things that's clearly just a game mechanic because it doesn't make any logical sense. It's a mechanic that's there for the game's sake and not for like any sort of I guess realism isn't the word I'm looking for, but authenticity, because it would be very strange if whenever you used a workbench for some reason you could only use it once in your entire life, and as soon as you invented something on it you had to make an entirely new one. It's just one of those mechanics that it obviously exists just to give you something else to spend your money on and upgrade, which is fair enough. And then the other thing is, once you reach this biome, the final one, the snowy area, enemies have a huge boost to their amount of health and the amount of damage they deal. Obviously, between biomes, enemies do get stronger, which makes sense, and you have to, keep up your patches to get stronger along with them. However, this biome takes that to like another level, where the enemies get very tough sometimes. I wouldn't say that it makes them incredibly hard, but it does make them take a lot of hits. I would say kind of an unnecessary amount of hits sometimes, although I also don't have a gold-rated damage patch because I haven't found one yet. So, yeah, it's just something to consider that later in the game, things do really kind of, the pace, I guess, slows down a little bit because things take a lot of hits to destroy. Overall, Sparklite is a really interesting game that is a very fun sort of homage to games like A Link to the Past and stuff like that with some newer mechanics, and a good environmental message as well. So it's a pretty solid game. It's available right now on Steam. The link is, as always, in the description below this video. Do check it out because it is a pretty awesome 2D action adventure that you would do well to play and try it out for yourself. There's also a demo available on the page if you just want to actually give it a shot without buying it at first to see if it's your kind of thing. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.